Well, hello there. Maybe you like fantasy novels. And if that's true, then there's a very important fantasy novel that you should know about. And it's called Gardens of the Moon. And it's by a Canadian author named Steven Erikson. And it's a tale of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's actually the first book in that series, which is a huge 10-book series, and it is by far the craziest, most awesome, and most epic fantasy series in the entire world. I would say by far. And so I've really wanted to talk about it. Now, I've done some other cheap, crappy videos about some Malazan novels and talking a little bit about the series as a whole. And for whatever reason, I haven't done Gardens of the Moon, which is the first book in the series. And that seems dumb, because if you're going to try and get people into a fantasy series, you probably want to talk about the first book to some degree. But the reason that's hard is just because when you're kind of doing a review for the first book in a series, there's the temptation and maybe the necessity to talk about the series as a whole, because you're not just going to be getting invested in the first book and leave it at that. The whole idea with series like this is you're going to get into the whole thing if it's good and if you're enjoying it. So making a pitch for the first book is very different than talking about the later books. You really need to get into the big picture a little more. And because Malazan is so complicated and huge and dense, that is hard to do. And it's quite different from most fantasy series as well, so it's hard to really convey to someone who hasn't read it, like, what it's all about. And I mean that just in terms of its structure on the one hand, but also just kind of the plot. Now, I remember asking people who have read it, like, what is Malazan about? And they go, well, it's about this and that, and, the explanation turns into this half-hour spiel, and you don't even know what it's about still after all of that. It's very complicated to sum it up, unlike, say, something like Lord of the Rings, where if you want me to sum that up, give you a very skeletal view of things, I'm going to say, well, there's a big evil Dark Lord, and he wants to get this magic ring, because if he does, he can basically get ultimate power. And this group of adventurers forms to go on a quest to destroy the ring, so the bad lord, evil man, can't get it. Pretty classic stuff. But pretty easy to give you an explanation like that. Now, I could go into further detail, but you kind of have a rough idea. Now, for Gardens of the Moon and the Malazan Book of the Fallen, that's a hard thing to do. What is it about? Well, I would say, if someone asked me that question, I wanted to try and keep it kind of short. I would really struggle, but I think, thematically, it's kind of about the power of compassion and the danger of apathy on the flip side of that, and also how the fallen can rise again. And the way explores all of that is through the Malazan Empire and these wars it's involved in and the characters that are interacting with those events. So that gives you a rough idea. It is a war fantasy. It's basically based around different kind of military campaigns and wars between massive, powerful factions. So, but what does all that mean? Well, let's just start with Gardens of the Moon here for a second, because that's what we want to kind of talk about. Gardens of the Moon starts with basically some gods. There's a god of shadow and a god of assassins, and for some reason, which will become clearer later on, they want to kind of dick with the Malazan Empire. So to do that, they basically possess this girl and kind of give her the essence of the god of assassins, and she becomes this hardcore killer. And they get her to get recruited into the Malazan Empire so that she can cause some trouble. But it's not about her. She's kind of an important character, but there's a lot more to it that's going to start unfolding pretty early on, and these different threads are going to be brought together to this final convergence or showdown in the end. And that's really what the series is. It's all these different threads that are established in the first several books, and then they start to get woven together, converging here, 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 and then everything's ultimately moving towards the grand finale that brings everything together. So the book kind of follows that pattern on its own, the pattern that the series itself follows. And for that reason, Gardens of the Moon is kind of a strange book, because viewed on its own, you do get like kind of a beginning and an end, and there's some resolution at the end of it. And at the same time, though, you're not really clear what its role is in the overall series, like you would be, say, after the first book of Wheel of Time or the first book of Song of Ice and Fire or something like that. Because in the next few books, you're going to be introduced to some different things, and they don't seem 100% related to this, but this series is, or this book is planting the first seeds, some of the first characters you're going to get to know. It's also establishing a lot about how the world works for you, different races and different lore. So it is important, but it's not clear how it's going to tie into things or where the series is going exactly. The main villain of the story, although he kind of has some background influence, I guess, on some events you hear about, he doesn't really have much involvement in this series or in this book directly. He'll just be mentioned in a couple sentences, really, in passing. But you are getting some of the characters who are going to move forward and advance the story in different ways. And you're going to see some of the different sides and get some of the setup for what's happening later. So it's a very strange book in that way, but it is satisfying and very engaging to read on its own. And I think very early on someone is going to recognize whether they're going to really like the series or not. Although it's worth mentioning that I think this book was written something like 10 years before the second one, because it took so long to get a publisher. And the writing quality, and I guess just the awesomeness of everything, I'd say does pick up a lot after the first book. So there's a chance that if you're not crazy about Gardens of the Moon, that you might be interested in pressing on. but I think it's very good on its own. Erikson, I think, is a very excellent writer even at this stage. I find the description and the scenes he sets up very cinematic and evocative, and I find his characters, even if they have a relatively small role, he develops them very efficiently, so they seem less like stock characters, even if they're like not super important in the grand scheme of things. Like, it feels very alive. So people might not necessarily have a lot of character progression on their own, but they're developed and they feel like kind of flesh and blood people. But he does that very efficiently because there's a huge cast of characters in this series. He also does epic scenes, like just so epic. Everything is so cool. The way he creates imagery in these very intense moments and builds up to things, it's all very well done. So those skills, even though he gets much better later on, I'd say he's quite strong in this book, even at the very beginning. So now, what else do you say? So there's with the first book of a fantasy series, you usually want to know kind of a few things, like what's the magic system like? And for Malazan, it's pretty cool and interesting. Basically, there's these kind of dimensions or subplanes that wizards are attuned to, and they can draw power from these different worlds or dimensions, like I said. So for example, like there's a healing warren, there's a fire warren, there's a warren of shadow, and these things are usually tied to gods in some way or different powerful figures. Then there's also like these other magical warrens that are tied to like some of the ancient races. And there's there's kind of a miscellaneous strange warren that works a little differently, which is the Imperial Warren of the Malazan Empire. But the magic system is very cool, and the wizards are kind of like siege engines in the wars because they're so powerful. And you see like the capabilities when the Malazan Empire goes up against this one city. Very early on in the story, in this flashback that happens, where it's like this huge magic battle between the Empire's wizards and this very powerful figure on this kind of floating fortress that's fighting against them. Blasts of magic coming down, demons being summoned, wizards being blasted apart, entire units getting wiped out. It's all very cool. So yeah, that's very interesting. You do learn more about the magic system, and it's not clearly explained necessarily for Gardens of the Moon, but you develop an intuition pretty early on about how it works. So that's all very good. Other stuff you care about in a fantasy series that you might be getting into is like just the cool stuff that's in fantasy series, like the monsters and the magic items and the different places and things. And Malazan has more cool stuff than any other fantasy series by far. Not just because it's so big, so there's kind of more room, but so many things. Their coolness is so high on the cool factor, like not just kind of cool or pretty cool, but like super cool. There's so much super cool stuff, and I know that's kind of like lowbrow language, maybe not very descriptive, but cool is a meaningful phrase, and that's important for fantasy stuff. And again, the coolness is off the charts for this. So even in Gardens of the Moon, Steven Erikson's not holding back. He's unleashing epic cool stuff very early on. So for example, like I said, gods get involved right away. So there's very powerful figures interacting with kind of the normal mortal world early on. So that, I guess, raises the power stakes a lot. But also, What other cool stuff is there? Well, the God of Shadow, he's got these like 7 powerful shadow hounds. They're very cool. There's this hardcore guy who kind of, when he comes on the scene, he's so powerful, he's like triggering volcanoes in the neighboring mountain range, and he goes toe to toe with 5 dragons, and he doesn't even care. Very epic, very cool. There's, for example, this race of, well, I guess they're kind of like Neanderthals in a way, but the whole race underwent this crazy ritual to turn them into these undead guys so that they could live forever. And the purpose for that was so that they could wage this tireless genocidal campaign against their arch enemies, this other race who they've kind of been in conflict with forever. So that's a very cool thing, because that ties into the Malazan Empire, because whoever sits on the throne of this undead race controls all of the undead army, and the person who used to sit on that throne was the former emperor of the Malazan Empire. So that's a huge weapon that the Malazan forces used to have. So that's very cool. There's also a guy on the side fighting the Malazan Empire. He's kind of like the series equivalent of a Dark Elf kind of guy. He's like this great warrior mage guy. And his sword, it's this massive black sword, and when you're around it, like, you hear like this subtle sound of chains kind of rattling. And the sword has this reputation, and everyone's terrified of it, because if this guy kills you with this sword, your soul gets sucked into it. And that might sound like Stormbringer from Elric or whatever. Soul-devouring sword's not that big a deal. But what happens to the soul when it goes in? This is very cool and interesting. So the soul goes in, and there's like this pocket dimension within the sword. And within that pocket dimension is the gateway to like the world of darkness. And it's within this gigantic wagon. And to this giant wagon, all these guys are chained, and they're pulling the wagon. And it's basically any soul who the sword has slain that gets chained to this wagon and has to pull it. So it's not just like punks and minions and stuff. It's like gods and dragons and demons are chained to this thing, and they have to keep pulling it. And when they die from sheer exhaustion, they get tossed onto the top of the wagon, which makes it heavier and harder to pull. And so the sword has to continuously kill more people to pull the wagon. Well, why do they have to pull the wagon? Well, it's because the forces of chaos are chasing this kind of caravan, and they're trying to get to the gateway of the world of darkness. And if they can't keep ahead of these forces of chaos, then, really bad things are going to happen. It's just kind of weird and interesting, and it'll play a big role throughout the series, but I don't know if it sounds cool the way I'm explaining it. But it's just one example. It's just one thing, again, that you're getting in the first book in the series. And those other things I mentioned, like some of these things you could do a whole book about, or a whole series about, like that undead army basically, and kind of their really crazy story. But that's just one cool thing in a series of tons of crazy cool stuff. There's also the Malazan Empire. One of the tricks up its sleeve is they have this special these special munitions, so like explosives and alchemical fire and things like that, that really give them an edge on the battlefield and against wizards too, because like I said, they're sort of like the siege engines of the Malazan world. So even a non-magic using Malazan soldier who has access to like explosives can do a lot of damage the way a mage can. So that's pretty interesting too. It's kind of an equalizer. There's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors thing that kind of happens because characters are so powerful, but there's often somebody quite a bit more powerful than them that in turn they might have a way that they can be defeated by someone else. So that's it. It's very interesting how powerful all the so many characters are in the series, with the gods and the ascendants and the wizards and some people who just have crazy power for no clear reason because it's not known exactly what the overall nature of everything is. Anyway, what was I saying? So yeah, there's just tons of cool stuff in the series, and they're not holding back from the very beginning. Gardens of the Moon is full of crazy stuff. And it's just a solid book with good action and good dialogue and good interesting characters, I think, and a very interesting fantasy world that you're getting a small piece of. And I think it's very worth diving into to check out whether you're going to like the Malazan series, because if you are, it's going to really rock your world. Now, that being said, I'm not sure what else I could cover about this series. I mean, this is kind of a stupid and long video already. I don't even know if I said anything all that helpful. But you have to read Gardens of the Moon if you're going to get into Malazan. You have to try to get into Malazan if you like fantasy series. It's just not worth missing out on, even if you end up not liking it enough to continue. Although, I think if you don't like Malazan, you might be a bad person. Maybe it's not a subjective issue. Maybe you just can't be cool unless you like Malazan. And I think maybe in 20, 30, or 40 years, I think it's going to really have its hardcore fan base spread the word, and it'll be a lot more well known. But it's still relatively new. Like, it only finished a few years ago. But importantly, it is finished, so you can get right into it. You're never going to be at the point where you're waiting for like the next book to come out. But remember, there are some other books that are interrelated, like Erikson's working on kind of a prequel series and then a sequel trilogy. Then there's Ian C. Esselmont, who's his friend, and they kind of made the world together, and he's got his own novels that kind of intersect with different aspects of the main series as well, and they're good. You could talk about those, but it's good to limit the scope a little bit for a rambling long video like this. So that being said, I think I've basically covered everything. Hopefully you get some sense that this is a good series to read, and Gardens of the Moon is a good book. The ending's a little weird, I will say, and it kind of unfolds in a different way than it's built up for you to expect, and you're kind of scratching your head a little bit with some stuff that happens at the end, but that's okay because you are going to learn more about the series as you go. It is a pretty satisfying ending. Some things aren't totally resolved, but a number of things are, so you do get kind of a satisfying conclusion to several threads that are going on, and that's pretty nice. But there's some major stuff that's set up, and it's going to continue in the third book, which is Memories of Ice. So that's more the direct sequel to this book. The second book after this one is actually Dead House Gates, and it'll take you to a whole different continent with just a few of these characters. Like, quick off the top of my head, I think you only get maybe 5 or 6 characters that move on to the next book out of a cast of like maybe 100 plus. So just that's something to be aware of, and that's one of the weird things about the series. But I think you have to check it out, and I'm gonna probably wrap this rambling unedited video up right now. Maybe leave some comments if you have some stuff to say about Gardens of the Moon or the Malazan series. If you have anything interesting about it that I've missed, which is very likely. yeah, leave some comments and maybe stay tuned. Maybe we'll talk about some more Malazan stuff in some other videos someday. Bye.